Tonight, you're not going anywhere cold. That is worth saying up front because this channel has taken you to some genuinely miserable places: frozen castle floors, ice-crusted ship decks, winter nights, where the wind came through the walls like it owned the place. Tonight is different. Tonight the air is warm. It carries the smell of something floral, not quite rose, not quite jasmine, but somewhere in between the particular evening perfume of a city that sits at the foot of mountains and knows in some deep cellular way that it is beautiful. Tonight we're stepping into Tehran, sometime in the 1960s, and we are following the women who lived there. Not the version of this story you've probably already heard, the photographs, the headlines, the shorthand. We are going somewhere slower than that, quieter. We're going into the kitchens and the classrooms and the hammams and the rooftop evenings, into the ordinary texture of lives that were far more complicated and far more interesting than any single image has ever been able to hold. Get comfortable. This one is going to take a while. The first thing you notice stepping into this Tehran is the light. It is that specific amber of late afternoon in a high-altitude city. Tehran sits at roughly 1,200 meters above sea level, and the air has a particular quality, because of it, a slight dryness, a slight crispness even in summer that makes the colours look a little more saturated than they do at sea level. The mountains to the north, the Alborz range, enormous and snow-capped, even in late spring catch the last of the sunlight, and hold it for a few extra minutes each evening as if reluctant to let the day go. The effect from the streets below is that Tehran glows. You're walking along one of the wide central avenues, the kind that were built in the 1930s by a government in love with the idea of modernity, wide enough for cars and trees in equal measure lined with plane trees, whose roots have since cracked the pavement in several places that everyone navigates around automatically without looking down. The sound is the sound of a city in full evening motion. Car horns, voices, the rhythmic clang of a metalworker somewhere down a side street, the particular high clear note of a street vendor announcing something you cannot make out the word, but the melody of it is unmistakable. The same melodic cry that vendors have used in Persian cities for longer than anyone can accurately date. And moving through all of this women in every possible configuration that 1965 Tehran had to offer, which turns out to be considerably more configurations than most people outside Iran would expect. A woman in a dark chador moving quickly, a cloth bag of vegetables bumping against her hip. Two university students side by side, deep in conversation, their arms full of textbooks, one of them gesturing emphatically with a pen she's not put down since she left class. A shopkeeper in a floral dress standing in the doorway of a fabric store watching the street with the calm authority of someone who has stood in that exact spot for 20 years and intends to stand there for 20 more. An older woman on a balcony above you, leaning on the railing, looking down at the avenue with the expression of someone who has seen a great deal and found most of it interesting. This is not a simple picture. It never was. Here is one of those facts that tends to catch people mid-breath in 1963. The same year, Iran granted women the right to vote and stand for parliament. Women in Switzerland still could not vote in federal elections. That particular gap in Swiss democracy would not close until 1971. Iran, a country that most Western narratives place firmly in the category of before, was running 8 years ahead of one of Europe's most proudly civilized nations on this particular measure. History is full of these small inversions, these moments where the story we thought we knew turns out to have been facing the wrong direction. But voting rights are a law, and laws are written on paper, and paper is not the same as a life. What we are interested in tonight is the life. The actual specific sensory complicated, sometimes contradictory life of women in Iran in the decades before 1979. The one that historians still argue about, still find surprising, still occasionally get wrong because it refuses to fit neatly into either the celebratory version or the critical one. Some researchers argue that the transformation of women's lives under the Pahlavi era was genuine and deep, that the opening of universities, the reform of family law, the entry of women into the professions, created real lasting change that reshaped what Iranian women believed was possible for themselves and their daughters. Others point out that much of this change was concentrated in Tehran, and a handful of other cities that rural women's lives were governed by rhythms that modernization barely touched, and that even in the capital, the gap between what the law said and what daily life actually looked like was wide enough to get lost in. Both of these arguments, as tends to be the case with the most interesting historical debates, are correct simultaneously. A curious detail worth pausing on: the first Iranian woman to earn a doctoral degree and hold a university chair did so in the 1940s. Dr. Fatemeh, professor of Russian language and comparative literature at Tehran University. The decade was the 1940s. The country was Iran. If that lands differently than you expected, you're beginning to understand exactly why this story is worth 2 hours of your evening. The light has shifted while you are standing there thinking about it. The amber has deepened to something closer to copper, the mountains catching fire at their peaks for the last few minutes of the day before the colour drains away and the sky above Tehran fades to the particular blue-grey of a warm city evening. Somewhere above you a window swings open, the scrape of wood on concrete, the brief rush of warm interior air, and from inside comes the smell of dinner being made. Rice. Something herbed and rich. The green, almost grassy depth of gourmet sabzi simmering on a stove, a smell that has been drifting from Tehran windows since long before this city existed in its current form. You stop walking. You tilt your head back slightly and just breathe. This is where the story starts. Not with a law or a revolution or a photograph, with a woman in a kitchen and a smell that finds you on the street, and an evening that is taking its time becoming night. The avenue stretches ahead of you, long and plane tree-lined and full of the particular low, golden noise of a city settling in for the evening. You follow it forward and the Tehran of 60 years ago begins slowly to open. The Hammam opens before dawn. Not by much, the sky outside is still the deep, undecided grey that comes in the hour before the light begins to actually commit to anything. And the streets of the neighbourhood are quiet enough that you can hear your own footsteps on the paving stones. But the door is unlocked, and through the gap comes a thread of warm, moist air that reaches out and wraps itself around your face like a gentle hand. You breathe it in. It smells of water and stone and something faintly herbed, the bundles of dried chamomile and mint that the attendant throws into the hot water cistern each morning. A habit so old that nobody can say exactly when it started or why, only that it has always been done this way and the mornings smell better for it. You push the door open and step inside. The neighbourhood Hammam, the public bathhouse, is one of those institutions that modern histories of Iran tend to skip over in their hurry to get to the politics, and that is a genuine loss, because for millions of Iranian women across centuries, the weekly visit to the Hammam was not simply an act of hygiene. It was something considerably more significant than that. It was in many ways the most important social event of the week, the one space that belonged entirely to women, the one place where the normal boundaries and hierarchies of daily life, who was richer, who was more educated, who had married better or worse, softened in the steam until they were barely visible, and what remained was simply the company of other women with all the warmth and candour that implies. The interior opens up before you as your eyes adjust. The entrance room, the salle binet, the dressing room is already occupied. Half a dozen women in various stages of arrival and departure, shawls draped over the low wooden benches that line the walls, bundles of clothing tied neatly and stacked in the cubicles overhead. The walls are tiled in the lower half, a deep geometric blue and white, the tiles slightly irregular, handmade, the grout between them darkened with decades of moisture. Above the tiles the plaster is warm ochre, and the light comes from small windows set high up near the ceiling. Each one a thick disc of coloured glass that turns the early morning light, what little there is of it yet, into something amber and gentle. The sound of the place is its own particular music. The soft slap of wet feet on stone, the low continuous murmur of voices, the distant hiss and bubble of the heating system, working somewhere in the walls, keeping the inner rooms at that specific temperature, not quite hot enough to be uncomfortable, but warm enough that every muscle in your body unlocks the moment you enter. Somewhere deeper in the building, someone is singing softly to themselves, the melody threading through the steam and the stone walls and arriving at your ears, already softened, already half dissolved into the general warmth. You surrender your clothes, wrap yourself in the thin cotton sheet that the attendant the Dalek hands you, with the brisk efficiency of someone who has handed out several thousand of these in her lifetime, and you move through into the inner chamber. The Hammam as a social institution in Iran is extraordinarily old. Historians trace formal public bathing culture in Persia back at least 2,000 years, and the particular architecture of the Islamic-era Hammam, with its domed ceilings pierced by star-shaped skylights, its sequence of rooms moving from cool to warm to hot, its network of underground pipes carrying heated water through the floors, had been refined and re-refined over centuries until it was very nearly perfect for its purpose. By the 20th century, even as private bathrooms became increasingly common in middle-class Tehran apartments, many women continued to visit the Hammam, not because they lacked alternatives at home, but because home had nothing to offer that could replace what the Hammam actually was. The inner chamber is extraordinary. The ceiling rises in a smooth dome above you, and near its apex are those star-shaped skylights, charagdan they are called, each one a small constellation of coloured glass that throws fragmented pools of pink and amber light down through the steam onto the wet stone floor below. The effect is somewhere between a cathedral and a dream. You stand still for a moment just to take it in. Around you, the social life of the neighbourhood is in full unhurried operation. In the corner, two older women are deep in a conversation that has clearly been going on for some time. Their voice is low and emphatic, the kind of conversation that covers several subjects simultaneously and loses track of none of them. Closer to you, a young woman is having her hair washed by their Alec, her eyes closed, her expression one of absolute uncomplicated surrender to the sensation the firm hands working through her hair, the warm water being poured from a copper tase held high so it comes down in a single heavy curtain. This is where matchmaking happened. That is not a romantic exaggeration, it is a straightforward historical fact. Mothers came to the Hammam specifically to observe potential daughters-in-law in the least ceremonial context imaginable, to assess how a young woman moved and carried herself when she was not performing for anyone to note the quality of her skin, and the thickness of her hair, and the ease of her manner with other women. A girl who was pleasant and unaffected in the Hammam was considered a reliable indicator of how she would be everywhere else. The logic is questionable, the practice was universal, a quirky detail that social historians of Iran tend to mention with barely concealed delight. Certain Hammam attendants in Tehran developed such refined reputations as informal matchmaking brokers that families would specifically request their services, bringing small gifts, a twist of good tea, a packet of dried fruit as retainers for their professional opinion. There were women in certain neighbourhoods of Tehran who effectively ran unofficial matrimonial agencies out of the steam room, and everyone knew it and no one found this arrangement even slightly unusual. There is a scholarly debate that runs quietly underneath the surface of all this warmth and sociability, and it concerns the question of exactly what the Hammam represented in the lives of Iranian women, whether it was a genuine space of female autonomy and community, or whether it was in part a contained and controlled space tolerated precisely because it channeled women's social energies into an enclosed and manageable location, away from the more explicitly public spheres that remained male-dominated. Some researchers argue powerfully for the first interpretation, others suggest both things were true at once, that the Hammam was simultaneously liberating and limiting a freedom that was also a boundary. The steam, as ever, makes it difficult to see clearly. You lower yourself into the warm water of the main pool, the heat arriving all at once from every direction immediately and completely, and feel every knotted thing in your body begin slowly to release its hold. The woman beside you shifts slightly to make room without being asked. She does not look at you. She's looking at the light coming through the star-shaped skylights above the amber and pink patterns, drifting slowly across the dome as the steam moves. Her expression is entirely peaceful. The Dalek moves between the women with her copper tears and her worn soft kissamit, efficient and unhurried, humming something low under her breath. Outside, the city is waking up. You can feel it distantly the way you can feel traffic through the soles of your feet when you stand on a pavement near a busy road, a faint vibration, an awareness of motion but removed from it buffered. In here, that world is at one careful remove. The steam thickens, the voices soften, the light shifts again as a cloud passes over the skylights outside. There is a particular generosity to this place, you think, a willingness to let time move at its own speed rather than the city's speed. And you understand, sitting there in the warm water with the light coming down through the dome and the conversation flowing quietly around you, why women came back here every week without fail across generations, regardless of whether they had a perfectly adequate bathroom at home. Some places are not about the washing. The kitchen announces itself before you even reach the door. It finds you in the hallway, a warm wall of scent that stops you mid-step the way a good smell always does, involuntarily the body responding before the mind has caught up. Turmeric, fried onion, the deep round sweetness of cinnamon meeting something savoury, the faint sourness of dried limes that have been simmering so long they have begun to fall apart, releasing whatever concentrated bitterness they have been holding inside themselves for months. It is not a simple smell. It is a smell with layers and history, a smell that has been building since early this morning and will not be finished building for several hours yet. You push the door open and step in. The kitchen of a middle-class Tehran household in the 1960s is not a large room. It was not designed to be impressive. It was designed to work, and it works with a focused, slightly crowded efficiency copper pots, arranged on shelves by size, their bottoms burnished to a warm gleam. Dried herbs hanging in bundles from a hook near the window, the herbs so numerous and varied that they have created their own small ecosystem of scent. In that corner of the room, chamomile and tarragon and fenugreek and dried barberries, all contributing to something too complex to name individually. A wooden cutting board worn smooth and slightly concave in the centre from decades of use. A small window above the sink, its glass slightly fogged from the steam through which you can see a fragment of the courtyard below a pomegranate tree. Its fruit still green and hard at this time of year, the branches moving slightly in the morning breeze. And at the centre of all of this, a woman. She's probably in her 40s, though it is difficult to say exactly. She has the kind of face that stopped being self-conscious about itself some years ago, which always makes age harder to read. She's wearing a house dress and a cloth tied over her hair, not for any reason of religious observance, but because she's cooking, and a hair near an open flame is a practical matter. She's stirring something in the largest pot on the stove with a long-handled spoon, and she's doing it with the slightly absent, deeply confident motion of someone who has made this dish so many times that her hands know it better than her mind does. She does not look up when you enter. This is her kitchen. You are in her space. The Iranian household kitchen in the mid-20th century was in a very specific and underappreciated sense a seat of power. Not the visible, documented, institutional kind of power that historians find easy to write about, not votes or laws or professional titles, but the quieter, more pervasive kind that operates through dependency and knowledge, and the daily management of things that everyone needs, and nobody fully understands until it is absent. The woman who ran this kitchen controlled the family's nutrition, its social calendar, its budget in ways that were never written down, and never fully acknowledged, but were understood by everyone who lived under the same roof. She knew, for instance, exactly how much the household spent on food each week, and she managed that figure with a precision that would have impressed a trained accountant. She negotiated directly with the neighbourhood butcher, the spice merchant, the vegetable seller at the market relationships, built over years, conducted in a rapid specific shorthand of quality assessments and price adjustments that were essentially a parallel economy running quietly alongside the official one. She knew which neighbours could be relied upon to return borrowed saffron, and which ones needed to be given slightly less than you could actually spare. She knew the difference between the dried limes from the south, which had a particular sharpness, and the ones from further east, which were mellower and better for certain dishes. This was not trivial knowledge. This was expertise. Here is a mainstream historical fact that tends to reframe things. Considerably surveys of Iranian household economics, conducted in the 1960s and 1970s, found that in a significant proportion of urban middle-class families, women managed the household budget entirely and independently, including making all decisions about food expenditure, children's clothing, and domestic maintenance. The husband typically provided the income. The wife decided where it went. This arrangement was so common and so unremarkable that most families, when asked, did not think to mention it as anything other than the obvious way things worked. The woman at the stove reaches for a small dish of dried barberries without looking. Her hand finds it automatically the same way your hand finds a light switch in a room you know well, and scatters a measured pinch into the pot. The tiny red-black berries hit the surface of the simmering liquid and immediately begin to release their colour, a thin thread of crimson unfurling slowly outward. You watch this and think about the word recipe. In many Iranian households of this period, recipes did not exist on paper. They existed in hands, in the particular pressure of a palm testing the resistance of dough, in the sound, the specific sizzle pitch that told you the oil was exactly hot enough for the onions, in the smell that meant 10 more minutes, the smell that meant almost the smell that meant now. This knowledge was passed from mother to daughter, not through instruction, so much as through proximity, through years of standing in this exact position, watching, absorbing, until one day you reached for the barberries without looking and realized your hand already knew where they were. A quirky detail that food historians of Iran find endlessly fascinating. The preparation of tardig, the crispy rice crust that forms at the bottom of the pot and is considered the highest prize of any Persian meal, is so technically demanding and so dependent on accumulated tactile knowledge that it has resisted every attempt at systematic instruction. Cookbooks written by Iranian women in the 20th century would describe the process in careful detail, and readers would follow those instructions exactly, and the tehdig would still come out wrong because the crucial information was not in the words, it was in the hands. Some researchers argue that this is not accidental, that the untranslatability of certain culinary knowledge was consciously or not one of the mechanisms by which women maintained their indispensable position within the household economy. Historians still debate how to categorize this kind of domestic authority, whether it constitutes genuine power or whether it is better understood as a form of highly skilled confinement expertise that was valued precisely because it kept women occupied within a space that men had decided was theirs. Some scholars argue that framing it as power at all is a kind of condescension, a way of making peace with limitation by renaming it. Others push back, arguing that the binary of power versus confinement is too blunt an instrument to understand lives that were considerably more nuanced than either option allows for. The debate continues, and the kitchen as always refuses to give a clean answer. The smell in the room has shifted slightly. The top note now is something caramelized, the onions having moved past golden into a deeper, richer amber, the smell that serious cooks wait for before the next step. The woman lifts the lid of the adjacent pot, releases a brief cloud of fragrant steam that blooms upward and then dissolves. Tastes something from the tip of the long spoon, considers it for a moment, with her head slightly tilted, and then adds a pinch of something from a small unmarked dish beside the stove. You will never know exactly what that pinch was. That is perhaps the point. From somewhere deeper in the apartment, the sound of a radio low. A woman singing something that you cannot quite identify, but which has the particular cadence of a love song, the melody rising and falling with that deliberate aching slowness that Persian classical music uses the way other traditions use silence. This sound drifts through the half-open kitchen door and mingles with the steam and the spice smell and the soft rhythmic scrape of the spoon against the bottom of the copper pot. Outside the small window, the pomegranate tree in the courtyard shifts again. A neighbour's voice rises briefly somewhere below, then fades. The city continues its morning indifferent and enormous all around this room and its quiet, absolute expertise. The woman at the stove does not look up. She has a great deal still to do. The classroom smells of chalk dust and fresh paint, and the particular institutional cleanliness of a building that is trying very hard to make a good impression. It is 1964, and this is the first week of the academic year at a girls' secondary school in a middle-class neighbourhood of Tehran. Not one of the prestigious northern districts where the wealthy families live, but a solid, respectable neighbourhood of apartment buildings and small shops and families who own their homes and consider education the most important investment a household can make. The building itself is new enough that the paint on the exterior walls still has a slight sheen in the morning light, the kind of pale institutional yellow that architects of this era seem to consider universally appropriate for schools, hospitals and government offices, as if that particular shade of yellow communicated seriousness and care simultaneously, which perhaps it did. You are sitting near the back of a classroom of 30 girls. The desks are wooden, arranged in 5 rows of 6, each one engraved with the accumulated evidence of previous occupants. Initials, small scratched drawings, a line of poetry and careful script that someone spent considerable time on before being presumably told to stop. Your desk wobbles slightly on the uneven floor, a minor annoyance you have already learned to compensate for by resting your weight slightly to the left. The window beside you is open, and through it comes the sound of the street below a cart, a car horn, the distant call of a vendor, and above that, overriding it, the smell of the plane trees, that clean green, dusty smell that Tehran's plane trees produce in autumn, when the leaves are just beginning to consider the possibility of turning. At the front of the room, the teacher is writing something on the blackboard. She's a woman in her early 30s, her hair pinned back with an efficiency that suggests she does not think about it much. Her dress, the dark, practical navy that Tehran's female teachers seem to favour in this era as a kind of unofficial uniform. Her handwriting is excellent, the letters formed with the confident, slightly stylised precision of someone who learned penmanship seriously and has never stopped caring about it. She is writing a line of Hafez, the 14th century poet, dead for 600 years and still here, still being written on blackboards in Tehran classrooms, still being asked of students who are 14 years old and would rather be thinking about almost anything else. You copy it into your notebook. The pen scratches on the paper. 30 pens scratch simultaneously a sound like very distant rain. The presence of these girls in this classroom writing affairs into their notebooks on a Tuesday morning in 1964 is the result of something that happened with extraordinary speed by the standards of history. Formal education for girls in Iran had begun in earnest only in 1907, when the first girls' primary school opened a development that was at the time considered radical enough to be genuinely dangerous by a significant portion of the population. Within a single generation, that radicalism had become so ordinary that it was mandatory. By the late 1930s, co-educational primary schools had been established across the country. By the 1960s, the girl who did not attend school was the exception, at least in urban Iran, and an exception that attracted comment. This is one of the most remarkable educational transformations of the 20th century, and it receives a fraction of the attention it deserves. In roughly 50 years, within the span of 2 generations, Iran went from a country where female literacy was vanishingly rare to one where urban girls routinely sat secondary school examinations, competed for university places and planned professional careers with the matter-of-fact confidence of people who have never been told that the thing they are doing is unusual. The teacher has put down her chalk and turned to face the class. She's asking a question about the Hafez line, not a factual question. A thinking question, the kind that does not have a single correct answer, and that experienced teachers deploy specifically to find out who in the room is actually paying attention versus who has developed the art of looking attentive while being mentally elsewhere. Several hands go up immediately. One girl near the front has both her hand raised and her body leaning slightly forward, the physical manifestation of someone whose answer is so ready that containing it feels like holding her breath. You glance sideways at the girl sharing your row. She's still looking at the board, her pen resting against her lower lip, her brow slightly furrowed in the particular way of someone who is genuinely thinking rather than performing thinking. Her notebook is open to a page that already has, you notice, considerably more writing on it than yours does. Her margins are dense with small additional notes in a different ink thing she's added earlier, and then return to a conversation she's having with herself on paper. Here is a mainstream historical fact that the numbers make vivid. In 1956, female literacy in Iran stood at roughly 8%. By 1976, 2 decades later, the last census before the revolution, it had risen to approximately 35% nationally and significantly higher in urban areas. In Tehran itself, female literacy among women under 30 in the mid-1970s was close to 80%, a single generation. The speed of it is, when you stop to think about it, almost vertiginous. But the numbers do not tell you everything. They do not tell you, for instance, about the specific negotiation that happened in many households every September when the new school year began and a father who had received no education himself had to reconcile his pride at his daughter's achievements with his unease at what those achievements might eventually lead her toward. They do not tell you about the girls who commuted an hour each way on crowded buses to reach a school that their own neighbourhood did not have. They do not tell you about the teacher at the front of this classroom who holds a degree from Tehran University and earns 2/3 of what her male colleagues earn for teaching the same subject in the boys' school 2 streets over, and who has decided after some internal debate to find this fact motivating rather than defeating, a quirky detail that educational historians of this period tend to find quietly extraordinary. Many of the women who became Iran's first generation of female university professors, judges and doctors in the 1950s and 1960s had been educated partly by female teachers who had themselves learned to read in secret in private houses from women who ran informal schools at a time when girls' education was not yet legal and not yet safe. The knowledge passed through those unofficial channels, whispered handwritten, carried from house to house before it ever reached a blackboard or a government building. There is an ongoing scholarly conversation about how much of this educational momentum was genuinely emancipatory and how much was instrumentalized by the state. Whether the Pahlavi government's enthusiasm for girls' education was driven by genuine commitment to gender equality or by the desire to produce a modern-looking, Western-facing society that could be displayed on the international stage. Some historians argue these motivations are separable and that the state's intentions matter enormously for how we assess the outcomes. Others suggest that for the girl sitting in the classroom, the question of why the state built her school is considerably less important than the fact of the school itself and what she does inside it. The girl with the dense margins is writing again. Her pen moves quickly, the scratch of it audible just above the ambient noise of the classroom. What she is writing you cannot see. But the urgency of it, the sense of something being captured before it escapes, is entirely visible. The teacher is moving between the desks, now pausing here and there, bending to look at someone's notebook, saying something quietly that makes the girl nod and write something additional. The chalk smell has settled. The plane tree outside sends a small gust of leaf-scented air through the open window, cool enough to be pleasant, and several heads turn toward it. Involuntarily, the instinctive response to something gentle arriving without warning. You look at your own notebook. The Hafez line sits there in your handwriting, slightly imperfect, slightly. Rush the ink, not quite dry yet, on the last few characters. You read it again slowly this time, and something in it, something about longing, about the distance between where you are and where you are trying to go, lands differently than it did the first time you copied it down. You write a small note in the margin. The argument started as many of the best arguments do over breakfast. Not a loud argument, not the kind with raised voices and slammed doors. This is a Tehran household in 1936, and the walls of the apartment are thin enough that the neighbours would hear everything, which is itself a powerful moderating force on domestic conflict. Now this is the other kind of argument, the quieter and in some ways more exhausting kind, conducted entirely in the register of pointed silences and carefully chosen words, and the specific way a cup of tea is set down on a saucer that communicates without any ambiguity whatsoever exactly how a person is feeling. The woman at the centre of it is in her late 20s. Her name is not recorded anywhere that history has thought to preserve it, but she exists in the sense that thousands of women like her existed, educated, urban, of the generation caught directly in the middle of one of the most disorienting policy decisions in modern Iranian history. On the 8th of January 1936, Reza Shah Pahlavi issued a decree. The veil, the hijab in all its forms from the full chador to the simple headscarf, was to be removed from Iranian public life. Not discouraged, not gently phased out, removed immediately, by force if necessary. Police were stationed at the entrances to public spaces. Women who arrived covered were turned away, or in some documented cases had their coverings physically removed. The decree applied everywhere: shops, cinemas, offices, streets. The logic, as the government stated it publicly, was modernization, progress, the liberation of women from a practice that suppressed their participation in national life. The woman at the breakfast table had not worn a hijab for several years. She had a university education. She worked outside the home. She had, by any measure, the government might have chosen to apply, already embraced the modernity the decree was designed to produce. And yet she is sitting here this morning with something knotted and uncomfortable in her chest that she's finding it difficult to name. Here is a mainstream historical fact that tends to make people pause. The 1936 decree was genuinely experienced by a significant proportion of Iranian women as traumatic rather than liberating, not because they opposed equality or education or public life. Many of those who suffered most acutely under the decree were themselves educated professional women who had chosen to wear the veil as a matter of personal or religious conviction, but because the right to choose had been removed along with the covering itself. A government that had decided to liberate women had done so by taking a decision away from them. The particular cruelty of that irony was not lost on the women who lived through it. Haleh Esfandiari, the Iranian scholar who spent decades interviewing women about this period, describes accounts of religious women who became functionally housebound. After the decree, women who had lived full active lives within their communities, but who found the prospect of going out uncovered so distressing, so violating of something fundamental to their sense of themselves, that they simply stopped going out at all. They did not protest. They did not demonstrate. They just stayed home, and the world continued without them, and the government that had claimed to liberate them had in practice made their lives smaller. You turn this over quietly, sitting at the breakfast table in this 1936 apartment, and the knot in your chest becomes slightly more nameable. It is the feeling of being a pawn in a game that claims to be about you. The tea in your glass has gone slightly cool. You drink it anyway. A quirky detail that historians of this period tend to mention almost reluctantly, as if they are not sure whether it is darkly comic or simply dark. When Reza Shah himself attended the first officially unveiled public ceremony in January 1936, a formal event at the teacher training college in Tehran, his own wife and daughters appeared unveiled beside him. It was, according to contemporary accounts, the first time many of those present had ever seen the Shah's family without coverings. His wife, Queen Taj ol-Muluk, was by several accounts visibly uncomfortable. The Shah appeared satisfied. These two things were simultaneously true, and nobody present was in a position to say so out loud. The comparison with neighbouring Turkey is one that scholars still return to repeatedly, and it reveals something important about the difference between transformation and imposition. Ataturk, pursuing similar modernisation goals in Turkey during roughly the same period, had chosen a different approach. He requested that women remove the veil, framed it as a personal choice aligned with national progress, and declined to make it a legal requirement. Women in Turkey largely did so over time without the law demanding it. Reza Shah chose compulsion. The outcomes in terms of visible compliance looked similar in the short term. The emotional residue was considerably different, and historians still debate whether the coercive approach ultimately strengthened or weakened the cause of women's genuine equality in Iran by associating modernization with state violence in the minds of those who experienced it most directly. The woman at the table stands up, takes her glass to the sink, rinses it under the tap. Through the kitchen window she can see the street below. A woman passing, bareheaded her hair, neat her coat, buttoned her face forward. The woman looks perfectly ordinary. She might be entirely comfortable. She might be devastated. From this distance, at this window, there is absolutely no way to tell that you think is perhaps the whole problem. There is a philosophical weight to this moment that the history books tend to flatten by reaching too quickly for a verdict. Was the unveiling good or bad, progressive or oppressive, a gift or a theft? But the women who lived through it did not have the luxury of a verdict. They had only the specific feeling of a specific morning, the strange sensation of a world that had decided to change the terms of their existence, without consulting them in either direction. The religious woman who lost her veil, the secular woman who gained a freedom she had not requested in quite this form, both of them standing in the same changed landscape, trying to find their footing. You look down at your own hands resting on the table. The morning light falls across them at an angle through the window. Outside, the street continues. A car passes. The plane trees hold their position indifferent to 1936, to decrease to the enormous invisible weight of being a woman at a hinge point in history. You reach for your coat. You will go out today as you do every day. You will walk through the city that has decided without asking you what your freedom looks like. And you will carry somewhere, just beneath the ordinary texture of the morning, the complicated feeling of living in a time when someone else's idea of your liberation has arrived before you were ready for it, or perhaps in a form you never wanted, or both. The door closes behind you. Your footsteps join the sound of the street, and the city absorbs you, as cities always do, making no distinction between the women who are grateful for this morning and the women who are grieving it, moving all of them forward together into the unchanged, indifferent, copper-lit Tehran day. The record player is in the corner of the sitting room on a low wooden cabinet that also holds a small stack of albums in paper sleeves, their edges soft from handling. It is an evening in the late 1950s, somewhere in the middle of Tehran's long, complicated love affair with its own popular music scene, a love affair that the city pursued with a kind of passionate, slightly guilty intensity, the way people tend to pursue things they have been told they should not want quite as much as they do. The room is warm, the curtains are drawn against the street. A single lamp casts a circle of amber light over the low table, and the cushions arranged around it, and in that light 3 women are sitting after dinner, doing nothing in particular, which is to say they are doing the thing that era and that city did better than almost anything else. They are simply being together in a room with music. The music comes first as a needle finding its groove, a faint scratch, a moment of pure potential, and then the sound opens up like a window. It begins with strings, a slow arching introduction that rises and then pauses as if gathering itself, and then the voice arrives. You do not need to know the name of the singer to feel what happens in the room when that voice comes through the speaker. Something in the air changes. The woman nearest the record player closes her eyes. Not dramatically, not the closed eyes of someone performing an emotion, but quietly the small involuntary closing of someone who has been reached somewhere they did not expect to be reached. The other 2 continue talking, but more softly now, their conversation reshaping itself around the music, the way water reshapes itself around a stone, finding a new channel without interrupting its own flow. The voice is a woman's voice. This is worth pausing on. For a very long time, for centuries in many contexts across the Islamic world, the public performance of a woman's voice had been considered problematic, restricted, or outright forbidden. The reasoning was theological and the enforcement was social, and the result was that women's musical lives had existed primarily in private, in households, in the spaces between walls, where what happened was nobody else's business. Then gradually and unevenly across the first half of the 20th century in Iran, something began to shift. The gramophone arrived, the radio followed, and suddenly a woman's voice could move through the air of a city without its owner being present, without anyone being able to say precisely where it was coming from or who was listening. By the 1940s, women's voices on gramophone records had been a feature of Iranian musical life for nearly 3 decades. The first recordings of female vocalists in Iran date to around 1912 during the Qajar era, a fact that tends to surprise people who assume the story moves only in one direction. By the 1950s and 1960s, female singers were not only recording but performing publicly, appearing on state radio building audiences that crossed every boundary of class and education and neighbourhood in the city. They were in a very specific sense the first Iranian women whose presence entered every household simultaneously, regardless of whether those households had chosen to open their doors to modernity or not. The radio did not ask permission, a curious detail that music historians of this period find endlessly rich. The earliest female vocalists to be recorded in Iran in the 1910s and 1920s often performed under pseudonyms, their real identities, carefully protected their families frequently unaware of or deliberately uninformed about their professional lives. The voice was public. The woman behind it remained strategically private. By the 1960s, this arrangement had inverted almost completely. Female singers were public figures whose faces appeared on magazine covers, whose personal lives were discussed in the press, whose performances sold out Tehran's concert halls. The speed of that inversion from hidden to visible in less than 50 years is one of the less examined marvels of 20th century Iranian cultural history. In the sitting room, the record has moved into its second song. This one is slower, the melody more searching, the kind of melody that seems to be asking a question it does not intend to answer. The woman with her eyes closed has opened them again. She's looking at nothing in particular. The middle distance, that private interior space that music sometimes creates in the air just in front of a person's face, here is a mainstream historical fact that reframes the texture of these evenings considerably. By the early 1970s, Iran had a thriving popular music industry centered in Tehran, producing records, hosting concerts, supporting female performers whose influence on Iranian cultural life was profound and largely unacknowledged in the political histories that would later be written about this period. Gugush, perhaps the most famous, was not simply a popular singer. She was for a generation of Iranian women a kind of living proof of something, that a woman's voice amplified and sent out into the world without apology could be the thing an entire city organized its evenings around. Scholars still debate with genuine warmth and some disagreement what exactly these female performers represented in the broader context of Iranian women's lives. Some researchers argue that their visibility was genuinely transformative, that hearing a woman's voice treated as worthy of a concert hall, worthy of a recording, worthy of the city's attention, changed something in how both women and men understood what women could be. Others suggest that female performers occupied a carefully bounded space, that their visibility was permitted precisely because it was spectacular and exceptional rather than ordinary, that a woman could be celebrated as a singer, while the same society remained uncomfortable with women as engineers or judges or anything that required showing up quietly and competently every day. Both arguments contain something true. The music in the room contains both things simultaneously, which is perhaps why it's so difficult to look away from, or in this case to stop listening to. The third song begins. It is different from the first two, lighter, slightly playful, the melody moving with a quick dancing energy that makes one of the women smile without meaning to the smile appearing on her face, the way smiles do when music finds exactly the right moment for them. She hums along just barely, the sound, almost inaudible, more felt than heard, a vibration in the throat rather than a note in the air. The woman beside her glances over and smiles in return, recognizing the song, and for a moment they are both humming it softly and slightly out of sync, which somehow makes it better rather than worse. The lamp flickers once, a brief dimming, the electricity doing something uncertain in the walls and then steadies again. The amber circle holds, the strings continue. Outside the street is quiet now, the city having reached that particular hour when the noise thins and what remains is the low continuous hum of a place that never entirely sleeps, but has at least agreed to lower its voice. In the corner the needle reaches the end of the record and lifts. A moment of silence, pure and complete, the absence of the music suddenly audible as its own kind of sound. Then one of the women rises, crosses the room and turns the record over. The needle finds its groove again. The scratch, the pause, the opening. The voice returns and the room receives it the way the room has always received it, with the quiet, uncomplicated gratitude of people who understand without needing to say, so that a woman's voice filling a space is not a small thing. It never was. The bazaar has its own weather. That is not a metaphor or not entirely step through the main gate of Tehran's Grand Bazaar on a summer morning, and the temperature drops 3 or 4 degrees immediately, the thick brick vaulting overhead holding the cool of the previous night like a stone cellar holds wine, releasing it slowly through the long hot hours of the day. The light changes too. Outside, the Tehran sun is direct and unambiguous, the kind of light that flattens everything it touches. In here, it arrives filtered and angled, falling in long dusty shafts through small round skylights, set at intervals along the vaulted ceiling, each shaft catching the particles of the bazaar's air dust, textile fibres, spice powder, the fine dry residue of 1,000 transactions, and making them briefly beautifully visible before they drift back into the general dimness. The sound is its own architecture. You hear it before you see anything a dense layered acoustic, that the high vaulted ceilings have been accumulating for centuries, the sum of 10,000 conversations conducted simultaneously at the particular volume that commerce requires, which is slightly louder than normal speech but pitched carefully to travel no further than necessary. Somewhere deeper in the bazaar, someone is hammering metal. The sound arrives at your ears already softened, already blended into everything else, a rhythmic pulse beneath the general roar. And the smell. The bazaar smell is one of those sensory experiences that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who has not encountered it. Because it is not a single smell, but a geography of smells, each section of the market producing its own contribution to the whole. The spice section announces itself from 20 metres away, a warm complex wave of cumin and dried rose petals and turmeric, and something sharper underneath that you cannot identify, but that the back of your throat recognises as related to pepper. The textile section smells of sizing and dye and the slightly waxy warmth of new cloth. The tea merchants produce a smell so specific and so concentrated that walking past their stalls on an empty stomach is an act of genuine self-discipline. You are moving through the carpet section now, and the smell here is wool, deep, slightly animal, the dry, dusty richness of old fibres pressed together under years of handling overlaid with the faint chemical brightness of newer dyes on the more recently made pieces stacked at the back of each stall. A woman is sitting on a low stool just inside the entrance of one of these stalls, and she is doing something with her hands, a quick repetitive motion that you cannot immediately identify, until you are close enough to see that she's sorting through a pile of dried herbs, separating the leaves from the stalks, with a speed that speaks of long practice. Her fingers moving independently of her attention, which is currently directed at the woman standing across from her, to whom she is saying something in a low, rapid voice that carries the rhythmic emphasis of someone making a point they have made before, and intend to have understood this time. This is Khanum Ahmadi, or someone very like her. She's in her 50s with the kind of broad, settled authority that certain women acquire when they have been conducting business from the same location for long enough that the location has become an extension of themselves. Her stall sells dried herbs and medicinal plants and certain specialty spices that you cannot find in the regular market, and she has been operating it, or rather her family has been operating it with her, at its centre for longer than most of the surrounding stallholders have been alive. The history of women in the Iranian bazaar is one of the genuinely under-examined subjects of this era, in part because it does not fit comfortably into either of the dominant narratives about Iranian women in the 20th century. Neither the progressive modernization story nor the traditional constraint story accounts for a woman like Khanum Ahmadi, who has been conducting independent commerce in one of the country's most important economic spaces for decades, entirely within traditional structures, without any of the legal reforms of the Pahlavi era having been necessary for her to do so. Here is a mainstream historical fact that reorients the picture considerably. Women's economic participation in Iranian bazaars predates the Pahlavi reforms by centuries. Not in every section, certain trades were male-dominated by custom. So deep it functioned as law, but in others, particularly those related to food, medicine, textiles, and certain luxury goods, women's presence as traders and merchants was so established and so unremarkable that the modernization-era discussions about women entering the workforce largely talked past them. These women were already there. They had always been there. The new laws changed the terms for educated urban professional women enormously, and changed almost nothing for the women of the bazaar who operated by a different set of rules that the state had never quite managed to fully codify or control, a quirky detail that economic historians of the Bazaar find quietly remarkable. The system of ta'aruf, the elaborate Persian etiquette of formal politeness, offer and counteroffer, the ritual of refusing something 3 times before accepting it, had developed in the commercial context of the Bazaar into an almost entirely separate language of negotiation that experienced female traders used with particular fluency. Observers noted that certain women merchants deployed ta'aruf with a precision that functioned less like politeness, and more like a highly sophisticated commercial tool using the rituals of deference to control the pace and terms of a transaction so completely that the other party frequently agreed to things they had not intended to agree to, while feeling entirely good about the interaction. You could call it manipulation. You could call it mastery. The distinction in the Bazaar was largely academic. Scholars still debate the extent to which the Bazaar represented genuine economic autonomy for the women who worked within it, or whether the structures of family and community that made their participation possible also limited the degree to which that participation was truly independent. A woman trading in her husband's stall was not in the same position as a woman trading in her own. A widow who had inherited a business occupied different ground than a daughter who worked alongside her father. The categories were fluid, and the power within them varied enormously from one family to the next, from one trade to the next, from one decade to the next. Khanum Ahmadi, for her part, does not appear to be troubling herself with these distinctions. She has concluded her point to the other woman's apparent satisfaction, or at least to her temporary silence, which in the Bazaar amounts to the same thing, and has turned her attention to you, or to the space just beside you, with the alert evaluating expression of a woman who has spent decades reading customers and has become extremely good at it. She says something to you in rapid Persian. The tone is welcoming, but efficient. There is tea implied in it, the offer hanging in the air with a particular Bazaar hospitality that is genuine and commercial, simultaneously both of those things without any contradiction. The dried herbs in her hands release their scent as she shifts them a green, slightly medicinal smell, clean and sharp, cutting through the layered Bazaar air like a clear note through noise. You take the stool she has indicated with a small motion of her chin. The tea arrives before you have quite decided to stay carried by a boy of about 12, who moves through the crowded aisle with the confident navigation of someone who's been doing this since he could walk the small glasses balanced on a battered tray, with the instinctive physics of long practice. You wrap your hands around the glass. It is, as always, too hot to hold properly. You hold it at the rim fingertips only in the way that everyone does, and the heat transfers slowly into your palms. Around you, the Bazaar continues its centuries-old negotiation with itself. The buying and selling and weighing and arguing and offering and refusing, the whole enormous patient machinery of commerce, conducted in the cool, dim, vaulted space that the city built and the city fills, and the city has never, in all its transformations, found a reason to abandon. Khanum Ahmadi is talking again. Her hands are still sorting the herbs, still moving with that quick automatic precision. But her eyes are on you now, and in them is the particular sharp warmth of someone who has a great deal to tell you, if you have the sense to stay and listen. You do. The tea arrives in stages. This is important to understand before anything else about the Kastegari. The formal marriage proposal visit can be properly understood. The tea is not incidental to the occasion. It is the occasion, or at least it is the mechanism by which the occasion is conducted, the medium through which every significant communication of the evening will pass without ever being stated directly. The quality of the tea signals how seriously the hosting family is taking this visit. The speed at which it is poured signals how comfortable they are with the guests. The moment at which the young woman herself carries the tray into the room, her first appearance, her first opportunity to be seen, and to see, is timed with a precision that every person present understands completely, and nobody will ever acknowledge out loud. It is an evening in 1958, and you are in the sitting room of a middle-class apartment in the Amirabad neighbourhood of Tehran. The room has been prepared with the quiet, comprehensive thoroughness of a stage being set, the good carpet unrolled, the crystal glasses brought out from the cabinet where they live for exactly these occasions, the cushions on the low sofas arranged with a casualness that required approximately 40 minutes of effort to achieve, fresh flowers on the low table, rose water in a small crystal dish. The smell of the room is warm and slightly sweet, a blend of the flowers and the rose water, and whatever is being prepared in the kitchen, a smell so specifically associated with formal visiting in Iranian households that encountering it anywhere else in the world would transport you instantly back to a room like this one. On one side of the room sit the guests, the young man's family. His mother occupies the central position with the unhurried authority of a woman who has conducted this ritual before and knows exactly what she's looking for. She is wearing her good dress and her good jewellery, both chosen to communicate prosperity without ostentation, a calculation that required its own considerable preparation earlier in the day. Beside her, the young man himself sits with the specific posture of someone trying very hard to appear relaxed, which is the posture least resembling relaxation that a human body is capable of producing. He's 26. He is a junior engineer at a government ministry. He has a good salary, a gentle manner, and the general impression of someone who will become more interesting in 10 years when he stops trying so hard. On the other side of the room sits the young woman's family, her father, her mother, her older brother, who's present mostly as a structural element of the occasion, rather than an active participant, his role being to exist in the room, in a way that communicates family solidarity and appropriate male presence. The father is a man who has read enough to be uncertain about things that less educated men in his position tend to be certain about, which makes him slightly harder to read than the occasion typically requires. And then there is the young woman herself not yet in the room. She is in the kitchen, and the kitchen is where the entire evening's real negotiation is currently happening, conducted in rapid whispers between herself and her mother, who's come back twice already, with intelligence reports from the sitting room, what the young man's mother is wearing, how she looked at the apartment, what she said about the flowers. The young woman is 22. She has completed 2 years of university before a family financial difficulty interrupted her studies, and she's been working as a bookkeeper at a textile company for the past year, a fact about which the young man's family has been informed, and about which their reaction has been, according to her mother's intelligence reports, cautiously positive. She's making the tea. Here is a mainstream historical fact that quietly reorganises the architecture of this scene under the Family Protection Law, which would be passed in 1967. 9 years from this particular evening, Iranian women would gain significantly expanded legal rights in matters of marriage, divorce and child custody. The minimum age for marriage would be raised. A husband's ability to take additional wives would be restricted. Women's right to initiate divorce would be meaningfully strengthened. These were real and consequential changes, but in 1958 in this kitchen with the tea brewing and the guests in the sitting room, those laws do not yet exist, and the young woman filling the glasses is operating within a legal framework that gives her considerably less formal protection than her own intelligence and capability might suggest she's entitled to. And yet, watch her hands as she arranges the glasses on the tray. There is nothing uncertain in them. She's moving with a quiet deliberateness that has nothing to do with submission and everything to do with strategy. She knows things about this evening that the sitting room does not know she knows. She knows, for instance, that her father has already told her privately that the decision is hers, a statement that is not legally required of him, and that places him in a small, significant minority of Tehran fathers of his generation. She knows that her older brother, despite his structural presence in the sitting room, has already told her that the young man seems decent, which from her brother, a person constitutionally incapable of dishonesty, carries real weight. She knows that she's spent the past 3 weeks gathering information about the young man through channels, that the formal ceremony of Kastagari was never designed to accommodate a friend who works in the same ministry, a cousin who went to school with his sister, a conversation at the textile company that yielded one small but telling detail about his character that she has been turning over quietly ever since. The tray is ready, the glasses are arranged, she picks it up, a quirky detail that historians of Iranian social life tend to mention, with a particular fondness the Kastagari visit had developed in urban Tehran households by the mid-20th century, such an elaborate system of non-verbal communication that experienced participants could conduct an entire secondary conversation entirely invisible to casual observers through the management of tea fruit and the strategic deployment of silence. A young woman who refilled a guest glass immediately signalled one thing. A young woman who paused fractionally before refilling signalled another. A young woman who refilled everyone's glass except the young man's by accident in front of his mother communicated something so specific and so devastating that it effectively ended the evening without a single direct word being spoken. Whether this system represented women's agency or women's confinement is a question that scholars still circle around without quite landing. Some researchers argue that the elaborate indirection of Kastagari communication was a genuine form of female power that in a culture where direct refusal was socially costly, the ability to communicate clearly through indirect means was not a limitation, but a skill, and that the women who possessed it were not constrained by the ritual but were in an important sense running it. Others contend that a system that requires a woman to express her most consequential life decisions through the angle of a teacup, rather than through direct speech, is not empowerment regardless of how skillfully it is deployed. The young woman carries the tray through the kitchen door and into the hallway, and for just a moment she pauses, not from hesitation, but from something more like the intake of breath before a considered action. The hallway is quiet. The sounds from the sitting room are muffled the low formal conversation of people performing formality at each other. Through the window at the end of the hallway, the lights of Tehran are beginning to appear one by one. As the evening deepens, the city arranging itself into its nightly constellation of lit windows and moving headlights, and the particular amber glow of the streets below. She looks at it for just a moment. Then she adjusts her grip on the tray, straightens slightly, and walks toward the sitting room door, carrying the tea and everything that the tea means, with the steady, unhurried step of someone who knows exactly what she's doing. The door opens, the room receives her, every eye in it moves toward her simultaneously, with the particular attention of people who understand that the evening has just entered its most important phase, though only some of them know that she has already decided. The young man's hands, you notice, are very still. She begins to pour. The cinema queue stretches halfway down the block. It is a Friday evening in 1972, and Tehran's movie palaces are doing what they do best on Friday evenings, which is absorb the city's enormous appetite for being somewhere dark and comfortable with a story unfolding in front of you. The queue outside the Metropole on Bazaar Avenue moves slowly, which nobody seems to mind, particularly the waiting as its own social event, the crowd arranged in loose clusters of friends and couples and families, the low hum of conversation, mixing with the smell of the lava shack vendor working the queue from a wheeled cart selling those thin sheets of dried sour plum that Tehranis consume in quantities that suggest either a deep cultural love or a mild collective compulsion, possibly both. You are near the middle of the queue, close enough to the entrance to see the poster in the illuminated frame beside the door, but far enough back that the evening still has some time to unfold before you get there. The poster is for an Iranian film, a woman's face, large and carefully lit her expression, carrying that particular quality of serious Iranian cinema, of this period which manages to be simultaneously beautiful and slightly troubled, as if beauty and trouble have decided in the Iranian cinematic tradition that they belong together and see no reason to separate. The Bazaar Avenue Cinema District is worth pausing on for a moment, because it represents something that has been almost entirely lost from the way the world remembers pre-revolutionary Tehran. In its prime, from the 1940s through the 1970s, Bazaar was Iran's Hollywood, its Leicester Square, its Boulevard de Capucines, a street so dense with cinemas and theatres and music halls that walking its full length on a Friday evening meant passing through a continuous corridor of light and sound, and the particular excited energy of a city giving itself permission to be entertained. At its peak, Tehran had well over 100 cinemas. 100. For a city of roughly 4 million people in the early 1970s, that ratio of screen to citizen is extraordinary by any standard, and it tells you something important about the appetite that Iranian urban culture developed for the particular kind of shared dreaming that cinema provides. And the women in those queues, the women in those seats, this is what tends to get lost. You step forward as the queue moves, and the woman behind you steps forward too close enough now that you can hear her conversation with her friend. Something about the director of tonight's film, a specific shot from his previous film that she found extraordinary, her friend disagreeing with a precision that suggests she has thought about it carefully and is enjoying the disagreement. They are both in their mid-20s, both carrying the particular energy of people who take their opinions seriously and consider the opinions of others worth arguing with. This is not a conversation about whether they are allowed to be here. It is a conversation about cinema. Here is a mainstream historical fact that consistently surprises people, encountering it for the first time. Iranian cinema in the 1960s and 1970s was producing films of genuine international artistic ambition, several of which were screened at European festivals and reviewed seriously by critics who had no particular investment in being generous about Iranian culture. The tradition that would eventually give the world directors like Abbas Kiarostami and Asghar Farhadi, both of whom are now studied in film schools globally, had its roots in exactly this period, in exactly these cinemas in the particular cultural ecosystem that was feeding audiences like the two women behind you in the queue their weekly diet of images and stories and arguments, and Iranian women were not just watching. They were appearing on screen directing writing, contributing to a film culture that was grappling sometimes obliquely and sometimes directly with questions about women's lives that the society around it was not always able to ask in plainer forms. Cinema had developed in the specific conditions of Pahlavi Iran a kind of coded fluency, a way of showing things that could not quite be said, asking things that could not quite be demanded in the language of light and composition, and the particular expressiveness of a face held in close-up for 3 seconds longer than strictly necessary, a quirky detail that film historians of this period find endlessly generative. The female performers of Iranian cinema in the 1960s and 1970s occupied an extraordinarily ambiguous social position, simultaneously celebrated as cultural icons featured on magazine covers, discussed in newspapers, their personal lives treated as public property in the way that celebrity culture has always treated its subjects, and yet socially categorized in ways that made their respectability a perpetually negotiated question. A woman could be the most famous face in the country and still find that certain doors in certain neighbourhoods were subtly less open to her than they were to women who had never been seen at all. Fame and respectability pulled in different directions, and the women who navigated both simultaneously did so with a kind of exhausting permanent diplomacy that rarely appears in the histories written about them. Scholars still actively debate the extent to which Iranian popular cinema of this period was genuinely feminist in its sensibility, or whether it reproduced the same limitations it appeared to challenge, whether films that centered women's experiences and gave actresses complex, morally serious roles were actually expanding the cultural possibilities for Iranian women, or whether the camera's attention was itself a kind of containment framing women as subjects of interest, without necessarily treating them as subjects with full authority over their own representation. The argument has not resolved, and the films themselves resist easy verdicts, which is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about them. The cue moves again. You're close to the door now, close enough to feel the slight warmth, coming from the foyer where the lights are brighter and the carpet underfoot changes from pavement to something patterned and slightly worn at the centre from decades of Friday evening feet. The woman taking tickets is wearing a uniform, a dark jacket, a small badge. She tears your ticket with the practiced minimal motion of someone who has torn 10,000 tickets and will tear 10,000 more, her eyes already moving to the next person in the queue before the two halves of your ticket have fully separated. Inside the foyer smells of the particular combination that cinema foyers have smelled of for as long as there have been. Cinema foyers, carpet and air conditioning, and something faintly chemical from the projection booth, undercut with the sweetness of whatever is being sold at the small refreshment counter along the far wall. A woman behind the counter is arranging something with quick, neat movements, her back half turned to the foyer. You move through into the auditorium. It is already 2/3 full, the low pre-film murmur of several hundred people settling themselves, the occasional laugh, the rustle of the lava shack wrappers that have made it this far, the soft thud of a seat folding down. The screen at the front is dark, a large dark rectangle holding its promise in reserve, patient in the way that all good stories are patient before they begin. You find your seat. The velvet of it is worn smooth at the armrests, the fabric slightly napped in the direction that 1,000 previous hands have stroked it. You settle in, feeling the particular reliable pleasure of a seat in a dark room with a story about to begin, a pleasure that is exactly the same in 1972 Tehran as it is anywhere else in the world in any year, which is perhaps the most democratic thing about cinema, that the darkness is the same for everyone who sits in it. The lights dim, not all at once, slowly, a gradual withdrawal, the auditorium letting go of its daytime self by degrees, the murmur dropping with the light, until what remains is the quiet breathing of several hundred people, agreeing simultaneously and without discussion to be somewhere else for the next 2 hours. The screen brightens, a woman's face, large, carefully lit, slightly troubled in that way the poster promised. She begins to speak, and in the dark, the city listens. The road out of Tehran takes you through a long, gradual unwinding. First, the city thins the apartment buildings, giving way to lower, more scattered structures, the wide avenues narrowing to roads that were not designed for the volume of traffic. They now carry the plane trees replaced by dust and the occasional cluster of poplars marking the presence of water somewhere nearby. Then the outskirts where the city and the not city negotiate their boundary in the provisional unfinished way of places that have not yet decided what they are half built. Walls, a mechanic's workshop open to the road, a tea house with 3 plastic chairs outside, and a hand-painted sign that has weathered past the point of easy reading. And then gradually, without any formal announcement, the city is behind you. And the landscape opens up into something that has been here considerably longer than Tehran, considerably longer than the Pahlavi dynasty, considerably longer than most of the events that the history books consider worth recording. The Iranian plateau. Vast and ochre, and ancient, the mountains rising at its edges like the walls of an enormous room. The sky above it a blue so deep and uninterrupted that looking at it for too long produces a mild vertigo, the sensation of falling upward into something without limit. You are in a village. The name does not matter. What matters is that it exists in the way Iranian villages have always existed, with the specific self-sufficiency of communities that have learned over many centuries to make do with what the land provides, and to distrust with well-earned pragmatism whatever arrives from the direction of the capital. The houses are mud brick, their walls thick enough to keep the interior cool in summer and hold warmth in winter, a passive engineering solution so elegantly suited to the climate that modern architects still study it with admiration. The rooftops are flat. The alleyways between the houses are narrow enough that 2 people cannot pass each other without one turning sideways, and the shadow they cast makes them 10 degrees cooler than the open air, which in summer is not a trivial consideration. A woman is sitting in one of these alleyways on a low wooden stool spinning. The spindle turns in her fingers with the unhurried hypnotic regularity of something that has been turning in this motion in this part of the world for approximately 8,000 years. The wool feeds through her left hand with a tension so precisely calibrated that it seems less like a skill than a physical fact about her, the way some people seem to simply produce music when they sit at an instrument, rather than working to produce it. She is not looking at her hands. She is looking down the alleyway to where 2 small children are conducting some kind of negotiation that involves a stick and a disputed piece of ground, their voices carrying in the clear village air with a clarity that the city with all its noise makes impossible. This is a different Iran, not better or worse, different and differently organized and governed by different rules, and largely untouched by the conversations happening in Tehran about women's rights and modernity, and the direction of the country, conversations that this woman has heard references to on the radio, but that land in her daily life with the distant muffled quality of noise from another room. Here is a mainstream historical fact that the Tehran-centered histories of this period tend to underweight. In 1966, approximately 60% of Iran's population still lived in rural areas. The transformations of the Pahlavi era, the education reforms, the family protection laws, the expansion of women's professional opportunities were real and consequential for the women they reached. But the women they reached most directly were urban, and the urban population was for most of this period a minority of the country's total. The woman spinning in this alleyway is not a footnote to the story of Iranian women in the 20th century. She is the majority of the story, and she tends to appear in histories only when the city remembers to look up from itself. Her life is organized by different coordinates entirely: the agricultural calendar, the water supply, the health of the livestock, the particular social architecture of a community small enough that everyone's business is functionally everyone else's business, which is simultaneously a form of suffocating surveillance and a form of comprehensive mutual support, both of those things inseparably. When her youngest child was ill last winter, 3 neighbouring women arrived within an hour with food and remedies, and the specific competent warmth of people who have managed illness without access to a hospital for generations and have developed accordingly. When her husband's brother's family lost their roof in the autumn rains, everyone in the village knew about it before the rain had stopped falling, and the repair happened communally over 3 days, the labour organised by the elder women of the neighbourhood, with the quiet logistical authority of people who have always understood that survival is a collective enterprise. A quirky detail that rural sociologists studying Iran in this period document with consistent fascination. In many Iranian villages, the management of the water supply, the qanat system, the ancient network of underground channels that brought water from the mountains to the fields and houses, was governed by an elaborate communal schedule that required constant negotiation and adjustment, and that this negotiation was frequently conducted by women, particularly older women, whose long residence in the village gave them both the knowledge and the standing to adjudicate disputes. Water. The most fundamental resource in an arid landscape was in many communities effectively administered by women through channels so old and so informal that no law had ever thought to formalize them, and no history had bothered to record them. Scholars still debate with genuine energy how to understand rural Iranian women's lives in this period, whether the concept of patriarchy developed largely in Western academic contexts adequately describes the actual dynamics of communities, where women's authority was real and recognised even if it operated through structures that looked from outside like limitation. Some researchers argue that romanticising rural women's agency risks obscuring the genuine hardships and constraints of their lives, the early marriages, the limited access to education, the physical demands of agricultural labour, the medical vulnerabilities that urban women were beginning to escape. Others push back against narratives that treat rural women purely as passive victims of underdevelopment, pointing to the richness and complexity of the social worlds they inhabited, and the very real forms of authority they exercised within them. The spindle turns, the wool thins between the woman's fingers. The two children at the end of the alleyway have resolved their dispute apparently in favour of the one with the stick, and are now engaged in something collaborative, their voices lower and more companionable. You watch the spinning and think about continuity, about the particular stubborn persistence of certain human activities across the upheavals of history, the way some things continue happening at the same speed, regardless of what is occurring in the capital. 8,000 years of this motion. The Achaemenids came and went. The Arabs came and went. The Mongols, the Safavids, the Qajars, the first Pahlavi, the second Pahlavi. Decrees about veils and votes and family law arriving from Tehran like weather changing some things and leaving others entirely undisturbed. The spindle turns. Outside the village, the plateau stretches in every direction to the base of the mountains, the afternoon light falling across it. At an angle now long shadows beginning to form behind every stone, and every small rise in the ground, the landscape slowly revealing its own topography as the day tilts toward evening. A smell drifts through the alleyway, bred from somewhere nearby, the particular smell of flatbread on a hot stone, a smell so immediately and completely domestic that it seems to carry warmth in itself regardless of the temperature of the air. The woman with the spindle closes her eyes for just a moment, lifting her face slightly in the direction of the smell. Then she opens her eyes and continues spinning, her hands moving with the same unhurried precision as before, as the alleyway holds its shadow and the village holds its breath in the long, golden pause before evening comes. Her bag is worn at the corners, not badly worn in the way that things are worn when they're used constantly and cared for consistently. The leather at the edges softened and slightly paled, but not cracked, the brass clasp still closing cleanly, despite the 1,000 times it has been opened and shut in the course of a working day. The bag belongs to a woman in her mid-40s who is currently sitting at a low table in a house near the edge of a Tehran neighbourhood, where the streets are narrower and the buildings older, and the air carries even now in the middle of the morning the faint green smell of the irrigation channels that still run along some of the back alleys, remnants of a water system that predates the city around it by several centuries. Her name is Marcier. She's not a doctor. Not officially, there is no certificate on the wall, no degree from Tehran University, no brass plate beside the door with her name and credentials. What there is instead is a reputation that has been building quietly for 23 years, passed from woman to woman through the specific channels that certain kinds of knowledge travel in whispered. At the Hammam mentioned at the end of a market visit, communicated in the particular shorthand of communities that have learned to maintain their own systems of expertise alongside and independent of the official ones. She's a midwife and a healer, and she has been both of those things since she was apprenticed to an older woman, who was both of those things before her, a chain of transmission that goes back through the neighbourhood, far enough that nobody can say with any certainty where it began or who first held the knowledge at its source. The room she works in is spare and clean, the cleanliness of it deliberate and precise rather than merely habitual, the kind of cleanliness that communicates to anyone who understands what this room is for that the person responsible for it takes the connection between cleanliness and safety with complete seriousness. A low daybed against one wall covered with a fresh cloth, copper basins graduated in size arranged on a shelf beside the window, bundles of dried plants hanging from the ceiling, some of them familiar chamomile and mint and dried lavender, and others less so, certain specific plants whose names exist only in the vocabulary of this tradition, and whose uses she could describe in detail, but that no pharmacopoeia of the Pahlavi era would have thought to include. A woman sits across from her, younger, perhaps 25 in the late stages of pregnancy, her hands resting on the dome of her abdomen with the instinctive protectiveness that the body seems to arrive at on its own without being taught. Marzier is talking to her, not in the brisk, efficient register of a formal medical appointment, but in something slower and more personal, a register that includes questions about how she's sleeping, what she's eating, whether her mother has visited recently, what her husband says when she's uncomfortable at night. She's taking a history, but the history she's taking is the whole history of a woman, and her life, not merely the medical portion of it, extracted and formatted for a chart. Here is a mainstream historical fact that lands differently the longer you sit with it. In 1960, Iran had approximately 3,000 trained physicians for a population of around 20 million people, and the vast majority of those physicians were based in urban centres, primarily Tehran. In the same year, the network of traditional midwives and healers operating across rural and urban Iran, women like Mazir, trained by apprenticeship licensed by community trust rather than government certification, was estimated to be handling the majority of births in the country. The official medical system and the traditional one coexisted in most communities, less as competitors than as parallel infrastructures serving different populations with different access. And the women who operated the traditional system were doing so with a practical competence refined over generations that the arriving official system had in many respects not yet matched. The Pahlavi government, to its credit, recognised this complexity earlier than many governments in comparable situations. A program launched in the 1960s attempted to work with existing traditional midwives rather than simply replacing them, training them in certain aspects of modern obstetric practice, providing them with basic equipment, creating a formal but flexible category that acknowledged their role, without requiring them to become something entirely different. The program had mixed results, as such programs generally do, but its existence represents a more sophisticated understanding of how knowledge actually circulates in communities than the simple modernization narrative usually allows for. Marzi opens her worn bag and removes from it with the same careful arrangement that a surgeon might use for instruments, a series of small items, a length of clean cloth, a specific dried preparation wrapped in paper, a small bottle of oil that smells when she unstoppers it briefly to check of something warm and slightly woody that you cannot immediately identify. She lays them on the table in a particular order that clearly has meaning, though the meaning is entirely internal to her practice and entirely opaque to anyone who has not been trained in it. A quirky detail that historians of traditional medicine in Iran document with consistent interest. Certain herbal preparations used by traditional Iranian midwives and healers were, when eventually analysed by modern pharmacological methods in the latter half of the 20th century, found to contain compounds with genuine therapeutic relevance, anti-inflammatory properties, mild uterotonic effects, antimicrobial activity. The knowledge of their use had been transmitted for generations through entirely experiential channels, with no understanding of the underlying biochemistry, and had arrived at effective applications through the accumulated trial and error of centuries. This is not unique to Iran. Traditional medical knowledge worldwide has repeatedly demonstrated this kind of embedded efficacy, but it complicates the clean narrative of modern medicine rescuing communities from the ignorance of traditional practice. Scholars still hold a genuine and unresolved debate about how to understand the figure of the traditional healer in this period, whether she represents a form of women's authority, a knowledge that deserves serious recognition, or whether the romanticization of traditional practice risks obscuring the real harms that came with its limitations, the maternal deaths that a trained physician might have prevented, the complications that herbal preparations could not address. Both things contain truth, and the tension between them does not resolve in either direction. Marzieh herself, if asked, would probably find the debate beside the point she is responsible for the woman sitting across from her, not for the debate about her role in the historical record. She is speaking again now, her voice low and steady, the unhurried cadence of someone who understands that the first thing a woman in late pregnancy needs from anyone who is supposed to help her is the simple evidence that she is not being rushed. Her hands rest on the table, still the worn bag open beside her. The young woman across from her is nodding slowly, her shoulders dropping slightly from where tension had been holding them. The room is quiet except for the sound of the street outside a cart. Children somewhere, the distant regular clang that might be a metal worker, or might be a construction site, the city doing its ordinary noisy work at a comfortable remove. There is something in this room that is very old and very specific. You feel it in the quality of the silence between Marzi's words, a silence that is not empty but loaded full of the accumulated weight of every woman who has sat where the young woman is sitting now, in rooms like this one, or in the open air, or in the particular intimate darkness of a village house at night with a lamp and a pair of experienced hands and the sound of something new arriving into the world. Marzier reaches across and places one hand briefly on the young woman's wrist, not to measure a pulse, or not only that the gesture is something more personal than a clinical assessment, a contact that says without words that this particular knowledge has a human face and has always had one, that it arrives not from a textbook, but from a long chain of women paying attention. The oil on the table catches the morning light from the window and holds it amber and warm perfectly still. Outside, the irrigation channel runs its ancient course along the alleyway, the water moving with the same quiet persistence it has always moved, with carrying the smell of green and stone and distance into the warm city air. The office building announces itself from the street with a particular brand of optimism. It is one of those mid-century government buildings that Tehran acquired in considerable numbers during the 1960s and 1970s. Not beautiful exactly, but purposeful, with the slightly forward-leaning energy of a country that has decided it is going somewhere, and has expressed that decision in reinforced concrete and large windows. The windows are the telling detail. Large windows on a government building say something specific. We have nothing to hide. The light is welcome. Modernity lives here. Whether the interior fully delivers on that promise is, as always, a more complicated question. It is 1971. You are standing on the pavement outside, watching the morning arriving, the street filling with its usual purposeful traffic, the smell of exhaust and bread from the bakery. 2 doors down, the particular Tehran morning light that comes in low and slightly golden at this hour, catching the dust in the air and doing something almost beautiful with it, before the day gets properly underway and the dust is just dust again. A woman walks past you and through the building's front entrance without breaking stride. She's carrying a leather briefcase, not Marzi's worn bag from the neighbourhood. Visits something altogether more architectural, a structured rectangle of dark brown leather with clean lines and a combination lock. The kind of object that communicates in the specific visual language of 1971 professional Tehran, that its owner has arrived at her position by a route that involved considerable study and considerable intent. Her coat is grey. Her heels are sensible rather than fashionable, the shoes of someone who walks considerable distances in the course of a working day and has made her peace with that fact. Her hair is pinned with an efficiency that, like the shoes, prioritizes function without entirely abandoning form. You follow her inside. The lobby smells of floor wax and paper, and the faint mineral smell of the water cooler standing against the far wall, sweating slightly in the morning warmth. A security guard behind a low desk nods as she passes, not the nod of someone acknowledging a superior, not the nod of someone acknowledging a subordinate, but the specific nod of someone acknowledging a known quantity, a person who has been coming through this lobby at this hour for long enough that her presence has become part of the furniture of the morning. She takes the stairs rather than the lift, which is currently occupied by a slow, mechanical deliberation between floors that suggests it is having some private difficulty. The stairwell smells of concrete and cleaning fluid, and her footsteps on the steps have the particular rhythm of someone who takes them 2 at a time when she thinks nobody's watching, which she does because she's already slightly late and has a meeting at 9. The office on the 3rd floor is a large open room divided by the arrangement of desks into something approximating zones, the kind of spatial organisation that predates open-plan offices but arrives at a similar solution through different logic, driven not by design philosophy, but by the practical reality of fitting more people into less space. Filing cabinets line one wall. A row of typewriters, most of them occupied, produce a collective sound that is somewhere between music and machinery. The irregular overlapping clatter of different people at different speeds, working through different documents, the sound of a government digesting its paperwork. Her desk is near the window. This matters more than it sounds. The window desk is not a trivial allocation in an office where the interior desks receive no natural light, and the fact that she has it reflects something about her position and tenure that no formal title would communicate as efficiently. On the desk, a framed photograph of 2 children faces toward her, rather than outward, a small private geography in the centre of the professional landscape. Beside it, a cup holding 3 pens and a letter opener. Beside that, a stack of files with a cloth-covered stone resting on top as a paperweight, the stone smooth and grey and slightly incongruous, in this setting a remnant of something personal smuggled into the official space. She's a civil servant in the Ministry of Education. Her official title, if you were to look it up in the relevant directory, would be something in the middle register of bureaucratic nomenclature, specific enough to indicate genuine responsibility, vague enough to tell you very little about what that responsibility actually involves in practice. What it actually involves in practice is a considerable amount of the substantive analytical and administrative work required to run a section of the department work that flows through her desk with a regularity and volume that has become over the years the most reliable argument for her indispensability. Here is a mainstream historical fact that the numbers make vivid without quite making simple. By 1970, women constituted approximately 30% of Iran's government workforce, a figure that represented a genuine and significant transformation from the near zero of 30 years earlier, and that placed Iran by that metric ahead of several European countries in female public sector participation. Women had been appointed as judges, as cabinet ministers, as senators, as university professors. The legal architecture of women's professional equality was on paper more complete than many countries in the world could claim at that time. The paper, however, did not sit at the desk. She sits at the desk, and sitting at the desk means navigating a set of realities that the legal architecture, for all its genuine progressiveness, has not fully addressed, and in some cases has not even fully acknowledged. The salary gap, for instance, documented in surveys of government employment from the period persistent across departments, explained in various ways by various administrators, and experienced by the women on the receiving end of it, as the specific grinding frustration of being paid less for work whose quality they can observe being assessed as equal or better, the meeting dynamics, the particular experience of presenting an analysis clearly and correctly, having it received with polite neutrality, and then watching a male colleague present a version of the same analysis 10 minutes later, and having it received as an insight. The management sealing the point at a certain level of seniority where the promotions began moving differently, where the informal networks that determined advancement operated through channels she was adjacent to but not fully inside. A quirky detail that sociologists studying Iranian workplaces in this period document, with a precision that comes from having interviewed enough women to see the pattern clearly. Female civil servants in Tehran government ministries in the 1960s and 1970s developed independently and without formal coordination a remarkably consistent set of strategies for navigating workplaces where their formal equality and their practical experience were in regular tension. They arrived earlier, they documented everything. They cultivated specific senior colleagues, usually the ones who had daughters of their own, which turned out to be a reliable predictor of a certain kind of pragmatic allyship. They became indispensable before they became ambitious, because indispensability was harder to dismiss than ambition. These were not strategies they read in books. They were strategies they developed from observation and from talking to each other in the particular frank register that the women's bathrooms of government buildings somehow consistently produced. Scholars still sit with the uncomfortable question of how to assess professional lives lived in this space between formal equality and practical limitation, whether the women who navigated it successfully were pioneers deserving of full recognition, or whether their very success at navigating an unequal system helped stabilize that system by demonstrating that it could be survived, thereby reducing the pressure to change it. The question does not have a clean answer, and the women who lived it were not in most cases spending their working hours on the question. They were spending their working hours on the actual work, which was considerable and which they were by every available measure doing well. The typewriter nearest her desk produces a particularly emphatic sequence of keystrokes and then stops. Its operator pulls the page free with a sharp tug, examines it, briefly makes a correction in pen, and feeds in a fresh sheet with the brisk economic motion of someone for whom this sequence is entirely automatic. She's reading something in the file on her desk, a pen held loosely in her right hand, not writing yet, but ready to write the pen, moving in small unconscious circles above the page, in the way that concentrated attention sometimes manifests in the body. Her coffee, brought from the small kitchen at the end of the corridor at 8:15, sits at her left elbow. It is almost certainly cold by now. She has not noticed. The window behind her shows a slice of Tehran rooftops, a water tower, the upper floors of the building across the street where another office full of people is doing its own version of the same morning. The light has shifted from its early golden angle to something more direct now the city fully lit, the working day established and underway. From somewhere down the corridor, voices, a brief exchange, laughter short, genuine, the unrehearsed kind. Then quiet again, and the return of the typewriters, the shuffle of paper, particular dense papery industry of a building full of people doing the ordinary, essential, largely unrecorded work of keeping a country running. She picks up the pen and begins to write. The stone paperweight holds its papers steady in the morning light. The record player in the sitting room has been quiet for an hour now, not because the evening is over. It is not the city outside, still carrying its low nocturnal hum through the closed windows, the occasional headlights sweeping across the ceiling as a car turns in the street below. The record player is quiet because the woman who usually puts the records on has been sitting in the chair beside it without moving her hands, folded in her lap, her eyes not quite focused on anything in the room, doing the thing that the interior life sometimes requires and that the busy surface of daily existence rarely allows, simply sitting with herself in the particular quality of silence that a private space at night can produce, when the children are asleep and the husband is reading in the next room and the city has agreed temporarily to lower its voice. She's thinking about music. Or rather, she's thinking around music the way you think around something you cannot look at directly. The fact that the songs she loves best, the ones that reach somewhere in her, that nothing else quite reaches, live most fully inside this room, not because she has been told they must, not because any law in 1973 Tehran requires her to keep her relationship with music domestic, but because something in the texture of this city, something in the unspoken grammar of its social life, has always drawn a quiet distinction between the private expression of feeling and its public equivalent. What you carry inside four walls is yours. What you carry into the street belongs in some diffuse way to everyone's opinion of it. This is Section 13's quiet subject, not the grand performances or the cinema cues or the professional offices, but the interior music of daily life, the private register in which Iranian women of this era conducted some of their most essential living. Think back for a moment to that sitting room in the late 1950s, the three women, the record player, the needle, finding its groove in the evening quiet. The music that filled that room was public in its origin, and private in its reception, a boundary that Iranian urban culture had learned to navigate with considerable sophistication. The radio brought the world's sound into the household. The household received it on its own terms. This division between what arrived from outside and what happened to it once it was inside is one of the defining features of women's cultural life in pre-revolutionary Tehran, and one of the most difficult things to convey to anyone who has not experienced a society organized around that particular boundary. Here is a mainstream historical fact that illuminates the geography of this interior life. Gugush, who by the early 1970s had become arguably the most beloved popular performer in Iran, released recordings that were played in homes across the country simultaneously in the apartments of secular professionals in northern Tehran, in the houses of traditional families in provincial cities, in the village tea houses of rural communities where the radio was the primary connection to the national cultural conversation. Her voice was everywhere. It crossed every boundary that the society around it maintained. And yet the experience of that voice was in each of those contexts a private experience received inside walls, held inside the listener, not necessarily carried back out into the street. A quirky detail that social historians of this period find quietly extraordinary surveys of Iranian households conducted in the 1970s consistently found that music was one of the most universal features of domestic life across class, region, and religious observance, that households which differed dramatically in almost every other cultural practice shared the presence of music, whether through radio record player or live performance, as a near constant feature of the home environment. Music was in a very specific sense the most democratic element of Iranian private life. It asked nothing of the listener except attention, and it gave back something that nothing else quite replicated. The woman in the chair has not moved. The city continues outside. Somewhere in the apartment, the sound of a page turning her husband still reading the small domestic signal of another consciousness present and occupied. She's thinking about her daughter. The thought arrives the way thoughts arrive at this hour sideways without announcement. Her daughter is 14 and has been asking recently about music lessons, specifically about the tar, the long-necked lute that sits in the corner of the room under its cloth. Cover the instrument that the woman herself learned to play as a girl and has played privately in this room for 20 years. The question of whether to say yes contains several smaller questions inside it, not about permission. Exactly, there is no prohibition, no practical barrier, but about what it means to hand something on, to pass from your own private relationship with something into the transmission of it, to make yourself temporarily a teacher rather than simply a keeper. Scholars still hold a genuine conversation about the nature of this interior cultural life, whether the richness of women's private musical and artistic practice in this period represents a genuine form of cultural agency, a space of real freedom and authentic expression, or whether it is better understood as the aestheticization of confinement, the human capacity to build beauty inside a boundary. Some researchers argue passionately for the first. Others suggest that the very eloquence of the private life risks making the public limitation invisible. She reaches out and lifts the cloth from the tar in the corner. The instrument catches the lamplight along its curved body, the wood warm and dark and slightly lustrous. She holds it for a moment without playing, just the weight of it in her hands, the familiar geometry of it, the faint smell of the wood and the strings. Then she sets it gently across her knees, finds the first position without looking, and begins to play so softly that the sound barely reaches the door. The city outside does not hear it. But it is playing. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with raised voices or crowds in the street, or moments that photograph well. It arrives instead in the form of a woman sitting down at a desk. She is not supposed to be sitting at or picking up a pen to write something she is not supposed to be writing, or standing quietly in a doorway and declining with perfect stillness to move. It is the courage of the long game, the patience of people who understand that the world changes slowly and have decided, despite that understanding, to push anyway. This is the courage that runs like a quiet river through the history of Iranian women, not the dramatic surges that make headlines, but the steady, persistent current underneath, the one that was moving long before 1979, and long before the Pahlavi reforms gave it formal channels to run through. You're going back further tonight, not to the 1960s or the 1950s, further. To a December evening in 1911, in the city of Tehran, when 300 women walked through the doors of the parliament building, the Majlis, carrying concealed weapons under their veils, and demanded to speak. Let that settle for a moment. 300 women, 1911, carrying weapons, walking into parliament. They were there because Iran's constitutional government was under threat from foreign interference, and they had decided that their silence on the matter was no longer something they were willing to offer. One young teacher among them, a poet named Zainab Amin, stood before the assembled men and recited her own verse calling on Iranians to resist and to boycott foreign goods. The foreign observer who recorded the scene described it as one of the most remarkable things he had witnessed in his considerable experience of political upheaval. The women themselves, by most accounts, considered it a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. This is where the thread begins, or rather this is one of the places where it surfaces into visibility, because the thread itself is older than any single event. The women of the 1911 Parliament were not inventing something new, they were continuing something, a mainstream historical fact that the condensed version of Iranian women's history tends to skip. The women's movement in Iran did not begin with the Pahlavi dynasty. It began in the late 19th century in the constitutional revolution of 1906 in the girls' schools that educated women were running privately in Tehran and Tabriz and Isfahan, at a time when such schools were not officially sanctioned, and their existence required a particular calibrated defiance, visible enough to function, invisible enough to survive. These women started newspapers, small handwritten, circulated carefully among trusted readers, publications with names that translated roughly as Women's World and Ladies' Magazine, produced in the first decade of the 20th century, by women who understood that the printed word was a form of presence that could move through spaces the body could not enter. The historian Haleh Esfandiari, who spent decades interviewing Iranian women about this history, described these early networks as extraordinary in their determination, women building connections between Tehran and the provinces, passing knowledge and encouragement along chains of correspondence that the official record barely noticed, and that the women themselves understood as essential infrastructure. The thread continues forward. In the 1920s and 1930s, as Reza Shah's modernization produced new opportunities and new constraints, simultaneously remember that 1936 morning the women who stayed indoors rather than go out unveiled the complicated gift of a liberation imposed by force. Some women navigated the contradictions by finding the spaces within the new structure that the old structure had not offered. The first female physician, the first female professor, the first female lawyer, Mehrangiz Manucherian, who began practicing in 1947 and spent her career using the law as an instrument of precisely the patient, persistent pressure that this particular kind of courage requires. A quirky detail worth sitting with Manucherian taught penal law at Tehran University from 1964, while simultaneously advocating for women's legal rights through every available channel, writing, lobbying, public speaking, the slow, accumulation of arguments made so carefully and so repeatedly that they eventually became difficult to dismiss. She was doing this at a time when the formal legal system still contained significant inequalities for women. She was using the tools of the system to argue against the system's own limitations from inside the system, with the patience of someone who has decided that patience is not the same as acceptance, the courage of the long game, the persistence of people who push anyway. Scholars approach this history with a necessary complexity, acknowledging the genuine achievements of these women, while also asking what the limits of their strategy were, whether the careful, incremental approach of working within existing structures ultimately changed those structures, or simply made them more comfortable to inhabit. Some researchers argue that the women who worked through official channels in this period were making the only choices available to them in conditions not of their choosing. Others suggest that the focus on individual achievement within the system drew energy away from the more fundamental structural challenges that would have required collective disruptive action to address. Both arguments are honest. Neither is complete. You think about continuity about the girl in the 1964 classroom copying Hafez into a notebook, with a pen that knew exactly what it was doing, her margins dense with additional thoughts. About the woman in the village alleyway spinning with hands that carried 8,000 years of practiced knowledge. About the woman in the government office arriving early and documenting everything, and cultivating allies with the strategic patience of someone playing a game that will not be finished in her lifetime. These are not separate stories. They are the same story, moving through different rooms of the same house at different speeds in different registers, all of them contributing to something that none of them could see in its entirety from where they stood. The river runs, the thread continues. The city outside is quiet now, or as quiet as it ever gets. The noise settled into the low murmur of a place that has agreed to rest but not to stop. Somewhere a woman is still awake, still reading, still writing something in a margin. She has been there the whole time. The distance between them is the width of a kitchen table. In physical terms, this is perhaps 1.5 meters, the particular dimensions of a table, bought in the early 1950s, from a furniture maker in the Bazaar, a solid piece of walnut that has hosted 20 years of family meals and homework sessions and the slow accumulation of daily life. Its surface marked here and there with the small permanent evidence of all that living a faint ring from a tea glass, a shallow groove where a child once pressed too hard with a pencil. Across that 1.5 meters, a mother and her daughter are sitting with the careful stillness of people who love each other very much and are currently finding that love insufficient to bridge something. It is 1975. The daughter is 23. She has just completed her degree in architecture from Tehran University, 4 years of studio work and technical drawing, and the particular sleep deprivation of a demanding program, emerge from the other end with a certificate and a set of skills, and the specific confidence of someone who has discovered through the testing process of education that their mind works and works well. She has a job offer. A real one from a firm in central Tehran that does institutional buildings, the kind of work that will put her drawings into concrete and glass, and let her walk past them on the street in 10 years and know that she made them. Her mother is 51. She married at 19, raised 4 children, has managed the household economy of this family for 30 years, with the precision and quiet authority we have already seen at work in other kitchens, other rooms. She can read and write. She was among the first generation of girls for whom primary school was available in her city. But her education ended at 14 when her own family's circumstances required it, and the particular world her daughter has just moved through is one she knows from the outside from the pride of watching it, rather than from the inside from the experience of inhabiting it. She is proud, this is not in question. The pride is real, and it is large, and it has been present since the day her daughter was accepted to the university, when she told the news to her sister on the telephone in a voice that had to work quite hard to maintain its ordinary register. She is proud in the deep, uncomplicated way of someone who has wanted something for another person for a long time and has watched it arrive. And yet, here is a mainstream historical fact that gives this kitchen table its particular charge. By the mid-1970s, the gap between mothers and daughters in urban Iran had become in educational terms one of the largest intergenerational leaps in the world. Women who had received little or no formal education were raising daughters who were attending university in numbers that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. The speed of this change compressed into a single generation meant that mothers and daughters were not simply living different lives, they were living in different epistemological worlds, operating with different assumptions about what was possible, what was normal, what a woman's life could reasonably contain. This produced something tender and complicated in many households. Not conflict exactly, not in most cases, not this kitchen table, but a kind of gap that love crossed and understanding sometimes struggled to follow. The mother who had built a life of real competence and genuine authority within the domestic sphere, and the daughter who was building a life of competence and authority outside it, could look at each other across 1.5 meters of walnut table and see in each other's eyes a reflection of what their own life was not. The daughter has been talking about the job offer, the location, the type of work, the salary which is more than her father earns, and she has decided after some consideration to mention this fact directly rather than around it. Her mother has been listening with the particular quality of attention she brings to things. She is working out her position on in real time, the slight forward tilt of the head, the hands still around the tea glass. A quirky detail that sociologists studying Iranian family life in this period document consistently. The relationship between educated daughters and their mothers in urban Iran in the 1960s and 1970s frequently developed over time into something that confounded the simple narrative of generational conflict. Many daughters described their mothers as their most important supporters, women who had not had access to the opportunities their daughters were claiming, and who consequently wanted those opportunities, claimed with a ferocity that sometimes exceeded the daughter's own ambition. The mother who had stayed home was sometimes the fiercest advocate for the daughter who did not. The gap in many families became not a source of division, but a source of momentum, the older generation pushing the younger one forward, with the particular urgency of people who know precisely the cost of the road not taken. Scholars still sit with the complexity of how to understand this pattern, whether it represents a form of vicarious liberation, the mother living through the daughter's freedom, or whether it is something more autonomous than that, a genuine and independent commitment to a different future that happened to flow through the available channel of a beloved child. The distinction matters, though it does not always resolve. The mother sets down her tea glass. The small sound of it on the table is not an ending, it is more like the sound of a decision being placed carefully on a surface ready to be examined. She looks at her daughter looks back. The walnut table holds the space between them patient and silent, as it has always held the space between the people who have sat at it. Then the mother asks about the firm, the specific question of a woman who wants to understand something properly, whose intelligence has always worked this way through the particular and the concrete, rather than the general and the abstract. The daughter begins to explain. Outside, the Tehran evening is doing what Tehran evenings do, the light changing slowly from amber to the deep blue of approaching night, the city settling into its nocturnal self, the mountains to the north disappearing into the darkness, while their presence remains felt, rather than seen, ancient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the gap across a kitchen table that two women are in their own quiet way crossing. It is January 1979 and Tehran is holding its breath. Not metaphorically, or not only metaphorically. The city has been holding its breath for months now, in the way that cities hold their breath, when something enormous is coming, and everyone can feel it and nobody can say exactly what shape it will take when it arrives. The strikes have been going on since the autumn. The demonstrations have grown in size and frequency, until they are not demonstrations anymore, in the ordinary sense not events that happen and then end and allow the city to return to its previous state, but something more like a continuous condition, a permanent rearrangement of the air that everyone is breathing. And yet, on this particular evening, in this particular apartment in a middle-class neighbourhood in the centre of Tehran, a woman is doing something ordinary. She's making tea. The samovar on the kitchen counter produces its familiar sound, a low, continuous simmer. The particular domestic voice that Iranian kitchens have been hearing for well over a century, a sound so completely woven into the texture of daily life that it functions less as noise than as a kind of auditory wallpaper present and unnoticed until it stops. The water is nearly ready. She sets out the glasses, the small waisted glasses, the ones that are always too hot to hold properly, with the automatic precision of someone who has set out tea glasses 10,000 times, and whose hands no longer require instructions for the task. Her name is Nahid. She's 38 years old. She works as a secondary school teacher teaching literature, and she has been teaching literature in this city for 14 years, long enough that she has former students who are now themselves in their late 20s, former students who are out in those streets tonight, whose faces she sometimes recognises in photographs in the newspapers and feels something complicated about. Long enough that the Hafez she has written on blackboards several hundred times has become inseparable from her own interior voice, the poems so thoroughly memorized that they surface unbidden at odd moments. While she is washing dishes, while she is walking to the bus stop, while she's lying awake at 3 a.m. listening to the city, she's listening to the radio. The radio in 1979 Tehran in January is a complicated object to be in a room with. It is the primary conduit for official information, which means it is also the primary conduit for official information's relationship with reality, a relationship that has been strained for some time. She listens with the particular calibrated skepticism of an educated woman who has been living in this city long enough to have developed a reliable instinct for the gap between what is being said and what is occurring. Here is a mainstream historical fact that this evening contains without announcing on January 16th, 1979, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left Iran. He would not return. The 37-year reign of the Second Pahlavi, the reign under which Iranian women had gained the vote, had entered universities and parliaments, and courtrooms and operating theatres, had built professional lives of a kind that their grandmothers could not have imagined was on this January evening functionally over. The Ayatollah Khomeini would return from exile in Paris on February 1st. The Islamic Republic would be declared in April. What comes next, Nahid does not yet know in its specifics, but she knows that something is ending. Everyone in the city knows that something is ending. The precise shape of what follows is the question that nobody can answer, and everyone is living inside. A curious detail that historians of this period return to repeatedly: a significant number of the women who participated most actively in the revolutionary movement of 1978 and 1979, who marched, who organised, who contributed their considerable education and energy to the effort to bring down the Shah's government, did so with the genuine conviction that the revolution would expand rather than contract their freedoms. The scholar Haleh Esfandiari, who was in Tehran in those months, describes the revolutionary atmosphere as one of extraordinary collective excitement that crossed every social boundary, that brought together women in chadors and women in miniskirts, marching side by side, united by the desire for political change, and by the promises still unspecific, still unexamined, of what that change would bring. What nobody asked clearly enough in the excitement of that collective moment was the question one scholar later framed precisely: what is the Islamic framework exactly? The answer, when it came quickly. Nahid pours the tea. The amber liquid fills each glass in turn, the colour of it catching the kitchen light, precise and unhurried. She's been pouring tea in this kitchen for 11 years since she and her husband moved into this apartment the year after they married. The kitchen knows her, the particular worn place on the floor in front of the stove, the shelf arranged in the order she arranged it, and has maintained ever since the small window above the sink through which she can see a fragment of the street below, where the plane tree has lost its leaves and stands bare against the January sky. She carries the tray into the sitting room. Her husband is there, reading the lamp on the table beside him, casting a circle of warm light over his book and his hands and the general quietness of the room, which is the quietness of a household that has run out of new things to say about what is happening and has arrived at the particular companionable silence of shared waiting. She sets the tray on the table and sits. The radio continues in the kitchen, its voice barely audible from here, a murmur, a presence the city speaking to itself in the other room. Outside, the plane tree is still. The street is quieter than it was an hour ago, the cold having persuaded most of the city indoors. Somewhere a car passes slowly, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling, and then it is gone, and the room returns to its lamplight and its silence, and its two people sitting with their tea in the last ordinary evening of a world that is without ceremony, without warning, preparing to become a different world entirely. She picks up her glass. It is as always too hot to hold properly. She holds it anyway at the rim, fingertips only, and feels the heat move slowly into her hands. The city that Nahid woke up in the following morning was on its surface the same city. The plane tree outside the window was still bare. The samovar still needed filling. The radio still murmured in the kitchen. And yet something in the quality of the air had shifted, something so subtle that you could not point to it directly. Only feel it at the edges of your attention, the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, the particular atmospheric pressure of a world that has passed through a threshold in the night and emerged on the other side into something not yet named. This is where the history books tend to end their sentence. The revolution came. Things changed. Full stop. But Nahid's life did not end at a full stop. Neither did the lives of the women who had carried the weight of this long, complicated century before her, the woman at the Hammam in the early morning blue-tiled warmth, the woman at the stove with her copper pots and her unmeasured pinch of something that changed everything, the girl in the classroom with her pen moving quickly and her margins already full. The thread does not end in 1979. It continues as threads do through every obstacle placed across its path changed in its direction, perhaps frayed in places but uncut. Think of what these women carried forward. Not the laws can be rewritten and were, not the professional titles, not the university certificates, not the specific freedoms that a specific government had extended and another government would retract. What they carried forward was something harder to legislate away, because it was harder to see the interior knowledge of what was possible. The girl who had grown up watching her mother manage the household budget with the precision of an accountant, who had sat in a university lecture hall and found her mind working and working well, who had heard a woman's voice on a record player fill a room with something that reached everyone in it equally. That girl carried a knowledge inside her that no decree could entirely reach. Here is a mainstream historical fact that the decades following 1979 would gradually and reluctantly confirm the culture of women's education that the Pahlavi era had established proved in the end more durable than the political structures around it. Within a decade of the revolution, Iranian women were entering universities in numbers that continued to grow rather than decline until by the early 2000s, women constituted the majority of university students in Iran. The knowledge once distributed had somewhere to go regardless of where the door was pointing. A quirky detail that historians find quietly extraordinary: the very women who had gained their confidence and their education under the Pahlavi era, and who had then participated in the revolution that dismantled that era's structures, carried that confidence and education forward into the new context, adapting it to new conditions with the same resourcefulness that Iranian women had been applying to their circumstances for centuries. The culture of education, as one scholar put it, was established. It did not wait for permission to continue. Scholars still hold the question of what the pre-revolutionary decades ultimately mean, whether they represent a genuine transformation, interrupted a road not fully taken, or a foundation that proved more enduring than the superstructure built on top of it. The honest answer is probably all three simultaneously, which is the answer that history most often gives when you press it on its meaning. The morning light is coming through the window now, the particular early light that arrives without drama, that simply accumulates until the room has more of it than it had before, and you cannot say exactly when the shift occurred. Nahid has finished her tea. The glass sits empty on the table, still faintly warm at its base. Outside, the plane tree catches the first direct light of the day, along its upper branches the bare winter wood briefly luminous. She's thinking about her students, specifically about one of them, a girl of 16 who had stayed after class last week to ask about a line of poetry. Not the assigned line, but a different one she had found herself and brought in on a folded piece of paper, wanting to know what it meant. The question had been genuine, the kind that comes from actually reading rather than from the performance of reading, and Nahid had felt answering it the particular satisfaction of work that is exactly what it should be. That girl will grow up in a different Iran than the one Nahid grew up in. The coordinates will be different. Some doors that were open will be closed, and some that were closed may in time open. Again, history does not move in straight lines, and Iran's women have never waited for straight lines to navigate by. They have always found the channels that were available and moved through them with the patience and the intelligence of people who have been navigating, since long before anyone thought to document the journey. Now let the story settle. You have travelled a long way tonight through the amber evenings of Tehran, through the warmth of the Hammam and the spice-thick air of the kitchen, through the scratching of pens in classrooms and the sound of a needle finding its groove in a sitting room, through the bazaar and the cinema and the government office and the village alleyway, where a woman spun wool with hands that carried centuries. You have sat at a kitchen table across a gap that love crossed and understanding followed slowly. You have held a glass of tea that was always too hot and held it anyway at the rim fingertips only. Let those images grow still now. Let them settle, the way light settles at the end of a long day, slowly, without effort, the bright edges softening into something quieter and more complete. The women you have followed tonight are at rest. The city they move through is sleeping. The mountains at its northern edge are dark, their snow-covered peaks invisible in the night, but present enormous and patient and entirely unchanged by everything that has happened in the valleys below. You are safe. The night holds you gently the same way it has always held the people who have moved through this story warmly, without condition, asking nothing except that you rest. Your breathing is slower now. The images are softer. The Tehran evenings, the copper pots, the amber light, the sound of music in a closed room, all of it is settling into the quiet place where good stories go, when they're finished, not gone, but resting. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let the last of the day's weight release from your shoulders, from your hands, from the place behind your eyes where thinking lives. The thread continues. It has always continued. But tonight it rests. And so do you. Sweet dreams.